Hi, I'm Francesca Maxime, and this is Wise Girl. And I am so thrilled to welcome a very special guest who is so generous with his time today. We met at the Psychotherapy Networker Conference about a week and a half ago, and he's the author of a couple of amazing books and a systems way of looking at therapy and holistic well-being that I think is really amazing. Dick Schwartz, Ph.D., the author of Internal Family Systems. That is the name of the model that we'll be talking about today. And also, Dick is the author of You Are the One That You've Been Waiting For. Forget about whoever's out there. It's who's inside you that we're also hoping to recover. Welcome, Dick. Thanks so much for joining us today on Wise Girl.
Thank you, Francesca. It's great to be with you.
It is. It's really amazing, the work that you do. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of this idea of therapy as opposed to, sort of the spiritual mindfulness track, and how your model, Internal Family Systems, actually pulls from both schools in many ways so that we can use some very tactical, sort of therapeutic interventions, but that we're also looking at something beyond just behavioral change. So can you just talk a little bit about IFS and introduce us to it for those who haven't yet been made aware of it?
Okay, I haven't found the perfect elevator speech yet, but I can give it a shot. So many years ago, actually, I'm pretty old, so this goes back about 35 years, my clients started talking about what they called different parts of them. I was working with eating disorders at the time, and so a client would say, when something bad happened in their life, it would trigger this critic who would call me names, and then that would bring up another part that could make me feel totally raw and young and empty and desperate. And then that part was so scary that almost to the rescue would come a binging part that would make me eat a lot. But the act of the binge would bring the critic back. And as clients described that, at first I thought, oh my God, they're multiple personality disordered people. But when I got over that and realized I've got some of these parts too, and they're as extreme about food as my clients, then I calmed down and I began to ask clients to describe more about how they all interacted inside of them. And because I have a background in family therapy, which is I have a Ph.D. in that, I could track the different ways they related inside my clients in the same ways that I was tracking the way families would interact with each other, different family members. And then through kind of trial and error with all of that, learned that these parts aren't what they seem, that in fact, they're all valuable. They all have wonderful resources to lend to us, but they're forced out of their naturally valuable states by traumas, by what are called attachment injuries. I suspect your audience knows about that. Mm-hmm. And are forced into roles to protect us that they don't like, but were necessary when we were young. And that they get frozen back in these young times, not even knowing that we're much older than we were before. And they feel like they still have to protect us in that same way. And then there are the parts of us that got hurt the most by those traumas and attachment injuries that carry what I call burdens, which are the extreme beliefs and emotions that came into us from those events and attach to these parts and make them feel terrified or feel ashamed or feel hurt. And once these very vulnerable young childlike parts of us get hurt, we tend to lock them away inside. So they become what I call exiles. And because we think we don't want to be around those emotions or thoughts or beliefs that now they carry. And not knowing that we're locking up our most precious juice by doing that. And when you get a lot of exiles, you need a lot of protectors, because now you become more vulnerable. The world can trigger you. If you get an exile triggered, it can pull you back into those horrible seeds. So you need more parts to form these protective roles. And so that's the way I view these internal systems that we all have. We all have exiles, we all have protectors. And just again, through trial and error back in the day, I found there was somebody else inside of my clients who knew how to heal these parts, knew how to relate to them in a healing way, and could become a kind of good attachment figure in the sense of attachment theory, where, you know, hopefully your caretaker, your parent, treated you in a healthy way, which allowed you to form a good attachment. Well, there is a kind of wisdom within us about how to do that for ourselves or for these parts, that as these, what I call parts, open space and relax a little bit, which meditation has a way of doing. What's called the ego is just a bunch of these manager parts who are trying their best to keep us safe. And when they relax, we can feel this sense of well-being, a sense of being present in our bodies, and a sense of acceptance that characterizes mindfulness meditation. So by getting these parts to open space this way, we enter this other state that I call the self, with a capital S. And to distinguish it between the most common use of the word self to describe the whole person, self is a kind of allergic word in the Buddhist communities. They like the word no self, but we're really talking about the same thing, this emptiness that's so full that exists when parts relax. So I found that same place that I call self cannot be damaged, exists in everyone, and can be accessed that simple way by encouraging parts to let it emerge. And when it emerges, it emerges almost like the same person in all of us. So we have, at some point I decided to kind of categorize or catalog the qualities that would emerge when people entered that self state. So we have calm, confident, curious, courageous, you've got them probably listed there, compassion, creativity, clarity, and connectedness. So that turns out to be who we really are. It's really a case of mistaken identity. We identify with these parts and their burdens and their extreme beliefs and feelings and thinks that's who we are. But it turns out that they aren't who we really are, that this essence is in there and can be accessed through meditation, but also in this other kind of releasing way. So I went on for a while, so.
No, I love that. And I love the fact that it's very clear that there is a holding and a respect for all of the different parts. Mm-hmm. And there's also sort of this groundwork. I call it like it's sort of like the rebar in the concrete underneath the building, right? Mm-hmm. Like the parts might be, you know, the windows and the doors and the, you know, whatever it is, but the underneath it all, the thing that's really supporting it all and that's really holding us up, and that's our inner dignity, our Buddha nature, our true nature, our basic goodness, whatever verbiage. Some people just call it presence or God. Mm-hmm. It could be religious language, it could be secular language, it could be therapeutic language. You call it the self with a capital S, which is also great. That we're recognizing and holding accountable these conditioned behaviors that you know very much are adaptive behaviors from whatever it was that we may not have adequately received when we were younger, that we needed, and that we're also saying, but we have the opportunity to heal. So I love it. My thing is about this is that a lot of people I have found, I have a very difficult time separating out parts or patterns from the self. They merge and they identify as the part. Can you talk about, I like to talk about applied mindfulness. So can we talk about how this shows up in real life when you're, for example, not you, but anyone is having an argument with their friend or their boss or their wife or husband or something like that, when they know that they're actually speaking from a part versus from their deeper self?
Yeah. Do you want to role play that, Francesca? Do you want to
We can, sure.
be such a person who comes to me asking for help?
Yeah, I mean, I just, Dick, I am having such a hard time. My boyfriend is, I don't know, he's not responding to my texts and my calls, and I'm getting really frustrated. And so I just finally gave in, and I fired off a text the other day, and I just said, listen, if you don't want to be with me, then just like, forget about it. I'm out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how can I help you with that? What would be useful to you? Do you want to get to know the part of you that fired off that email?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're doing a role play. That was just a role play. I don't have.
Well, I know. Let's stay with the role play.
Okay. So, do I want to get to know that part of me? I don't know. I feel like I always find myself in this kind of a situation with these kind of people, and this is something that I keep doing, and I don't know how not to do it, but I also feel like he deserves it because he's been ignoring me.
I get that. So in terms of what you typically see in your pattern, it'll get to a point where you'll say, I'm out of here, or you've got to do something or else. Something like that?
Yeah, I just get so frustrated. I feel like it's hopeless, and I just want to give up.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one part of you that wants to just give up and not even try with boyfriends anymore. And then there's other part of you that gets furious when they do something like you described and tries to protect you by getting them to behave. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, I have rights too, like.
That's what that part says, right? Yeah. And then is there another part of you that gets very hurt by these things that they do?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, there's a part of me that it reminds me of the past when I've had relationships that have gone south that I feel really bad about. And I feel like I get stuck there and, I won't be able to move on. Okay.
So there's a part that becomes critical of you and thinks there may be something wrong with you about this.
I think that, unless I figure this out, maybe I'll never be able to
have a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. Or have a happy one.
Okay. All right. So we can step out for a second. So, in just a couple minutes, we've identified 3 or 4 different parts of you that are involved in this pattern. And at some point, I would just say, is there one of those you'd like to start with? We can actually change all of this if you're interested. And so you might pick the one that gets so angry, or you might pick the one that's so despairing and feels hopeless. And then I would just have you focus on it. Do you want to role play that piece of it?
Sure, we can try. Let's see. How about the one that feels like hopeless? Like I feel like, this just back and role. Like I'm just not good enough, or nobody's going to like me, or always going to be a problem, and I don't know what's wrong with me.
Yeah. Okay. So you'd like to maybe help that part that feels that way. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right. So focus on that one exclusively for a second inside, and see where you find it in your body or around your body, just as you notice it.
So like, where in my body am I feeling it? Like my belly, kind of.
Yeah. That's right.
My lower abdomen.
Yeah. So focus right there on your belly, your lower abdomen. And as you notice that one who thinks maybe there's something wrong with you, how do you feel toward it as you see it there, as you notice it there? How do you like or dislike this part of you?
Well, there's a part of me that thinks that she's crazy because I don't think that there's anything wrong. But then there's another part of me that says, well, there has to be because this hasn't worked out.
It's not working. Yeah, right. Okay. So we're going to ask both of those. They each have valid things to say, but we're going to ask both those parts to give us just a little bit of space so we can get to know this one in your belly. We're not going to, and we might even be able to help it feel better. But to do that, we need to get you in a different place. So just see if these other parts would relax just a little bit back inside there.
So we're asking these parts of mind to just sort of take a step back, like a few feet or a yard or so, just to.
Perfect. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Okay. And then focus again on the one in your gut,
Mm-hmm.
and tell me how you feel toward it now.
Yeah, there's a little more space. There's not so much connection and fusion between the two.
Good. And how do you feel toward it as you notice the space?
I have a little more compassion for it.
Okay. So could you let it know that inside? Just let it know you care about it and you're sorry that it's hurting, and just see how it reacts to your compassion.
Yeah, it's like sort of telling me that it wants me to rescue it from this place.
Yeah. So tell it we're going to do that.
So I'm here to rescue you.
That's right. Exactly.
From this place.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And see how it reacts.
Finally, it's.
And do you see it in there, or you just sense it down there? You have an image for it?
Oh yeah, she's like 5.
Okay. Okay, good. So let her know you see that she's like a 5-year-old girl who's been hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have a sense of how close you are to her in there?
Yeah, we're like standing next to each other. She's kind of like next to me, holding hands.
Okay. Now, do you see yourself holding her hand, or are you there doing it?
You mean like an image in my mind's eye?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't want you to see yourself. I actually want whatever part is trying to do it for you to give us some space too. So
Okay.
you're there. You see the little girl, but just like if she were in your room right now, you wouldn't see yourself. You'd be with her. See if that can happen.
So this isn't an image. This isn't a visualization. This is me actually being with her.
Yeah, you might see her, but you don't see yourself.
Aha. So who is the me that's with her?
Good question. But just try it. Just see what happens.
Uh-huh.
It's the observer who's been observing. I want that person to be there with her.
Right. Yes, the one that can see.
The you. The you. I just want you to be there.
Okay.
With her. And tell me when you're there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I could say that I'm there.
Okay. And how's she reacting to you being with her?
The
5-year-old.
The 5-year-old, yeah, she's like, yeah, that's cool.
Okay, good. And just see what she wants you to know about herself right now as you're with her. Whatever and don't think of the answer, just wait for an answer to come from her.
She just says, listen, I've needed your help for a long time, and thank you for paying attention to me, because I've been trying to get your attention for a long time, and yeah, you're here. Finally,
Okay.
You're not ignoring me.
All right, fantastic. All right, so we can step out again if you want, Francesca, or we can keep going.
Okay, all right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so that was a good example of a fairly quick process where you're not just being mindful of your thoughts and emotions from a kind of observing place, you're actually going to them and in an active way becoming a good inner parent or good leader of this inner system. And actually that kind of compassion helps these parts heal. We could, if we stayed with it, we could actually help that little 5-year-old unload the feelings and beliefs she carries from whatever happened to her in the past. We would first have to witness what happened to her. You would. I wouldn't have to necessarily. And how bad it was. And then we'd get her out of where she's stuck back there. And then we would help her unload the feelings and beliefs she's been carrying all these years.
That's interesting. Like, you know, from journalist, like I'm back on my journalist hat now, from the perspective of sort of this unburdening that you talked about earlier that you're referring to now, I think, in terms of the 5-year-old. I think a lot of people are resistant to therapy in general, whether it's your method or any method for that matter, because they are afraid to go there. And yet, what I've continued, meaning doing the deeper work, what I've continued to hear from folks is at some point, it kind of, you do have to go there if you want to actually get to the radical, the root of the healing. And that healing is possible. Our brains are plastic. Our body can learn new habits. But what I hear different from your method, that's different from, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that, is that you're holding yourself with the larger S self of you that is in some ways beyond just you. It's the wiser, deeper knowing of you, but that's right. There's some larger energy that you're connecting to as well.
That's right.
Can you talk about how that play, I mean, we just did it a little bit, but how that might be a way to invite more people into trying to try therapy when they otherwise might be just terrified that it's just a black hole that's going to suck them down and they'll never come out?
Yeah, so a lot of people are terrified of going to their exiles, what I call their exiles, which would be that 5-year-old girl you were with, for good reasons. They have good reasons to be afraid, because in the past, whenever the door was opened somehow, whenever those exiles got triggered and burst forward, it was like flames of emotions totally overwhelmed them, and they thought they were going to die, and they couldn't get out of bed for a week, or it really interfered with their ability to function. So they have these protectors who said, I'm not opening that door again. And you can totally empathize with why they wouldn't want to do that. So to convince someone to do that, we have to come saying, we can open that door without any of that happening to you. And we're not doing it just to grovel in what's in there. We're not doing that to make you a victim. We're doing it to go in and get the parts you left back there out of there and help them unload these feelings and beliefs they've been carrying all this time. And we can do that without you being overwhelmed by it. And I know how to do it. I know how to do it very clearly, safely. I could describe how we would do it in advance, so it would be a totally educated decision. And I still get it be very scary to do. But it's a lot less scary when, first of all, I don't even need to know what's in there. You don't have to tell me what you see when you open that door. It's for you to get. And there is this person in you that I call yourself who can do all of this that I'm describing that you don't even know yet. You don't even know you have. And I would help you access that person who would be the one to go in. And like we found, there are parts who want to do it for you, which is the one who was holding your hand at first. But that part is not nearly as effective as yourself when you finally went in to do it. So that's my pitch to people. And if their protectors can believe half of what I just said, they're much more interested in trying it than if they think that they're going to have to do this deep dive from which they may never return.
Yeah, I think that that's really a critical point, because I feel like a lot of folks who are trying to heal, I think that there's basically two things that we can do. We can address symptoms, or we can address the problem itself. And the problem itself is not you, right? It's never the self. The self is problem-free.
Right.
But behavior can be problematic, the conditioning, the habits.
Or again, I part of why I am a kind of crusader for the parts language is because if you think of it as a conditioned behavior pattern or thought pattern, it doesn't open the door so much to relate to it with compassion than if you thought of it as a little girl, or you thought of it as some part of you that's suffering and is extreme because it was forced to do this job. So I'm a kind of crusader for the personhood of these inner entities, because that translates into a much more compassionate way of relating to yourself inside.
Totally. I I respect that, and I appreciate you pointing that out in terms of a way that we can continue to look at things that are little people inside that may or may not be working on our best behalf at the moment, but who deserve our respect because they in fact very much did do their job when it was required.
Absolutely.
And are still doing it. So let's talk a little bit about how this would work in terms of we saw how it would work in like a therapeutic setting when, you know, I'm sitting with you. How can someone take this kind of a model in their day-to-day life?
Yeah.
You know, at work, I'm having a problem with my boss. I think that he doesn't like my latest report. I'm worried about my job. A part of me is getting triggered that may say I'm not, you know, good enough, which seems to be the greatest affliction of most folks that I've met anyway.
Yeah. So as you get to know these parts and begin to change your relationship with them. So, you know, when you first focused on that 5-year-old, turned out to be a 5-year-old, and I asked you how you felt toward it, you know, you had parts that had different feelings, but those feelings and the ways of relating to it get in the way. So if I can initially get you, and it doesn't have to be in therapy, but just even from reading about it or something, to begin to see the critic rather than as an arch enemy, which most people do see it as, and instead see it as a part that's desperately trying to keep you safe and will criticize you to try and make you behave better or look better or perform better, or to try and run your confidence down so you don't take any risks. Then, before you go to meet with your boss, you go to that part and you say, I get you're trying to protect me, and I get that you think the way to do it is to make me feel bad or prepare me for the you know, disappointment or something like that. But I really don't need that right now because I'm not a little kid anymore. I can actually handle much more than I could back when you really needed to do this for me. And would you give me a little space so I can be there and I can be in my body when I interact with him? And, you know, many cases, people will feel this palpable shift and they'll feel immediately much more grounded, and they'll be able to function from this open-hearted but, you know, strong place that I call self.
Right.
So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say two things about that. One is, I think a lot of people carry around a lot of resentment and anger toward their offenders, whoever they are, whether they're parents or early caregivers or, you know, anyone who has either neglected them or abused them or in any way, shape, or form not met their needs when they needed them and were helpless. And there's still an element of wanting that person, whoever that was, whether they're alive or dead, doesn't matter, to be one to fix it. And oftentimes when that doesn't happen, they then will ask their spouse or their friend circle to be the ones to fix it. What I hear you saying is this is about personal responsibility in terms of knowing that you have this deeper and greater capacity within you. But I also feel like that there's a shift there because somebody's going to have to be willing to give up the wish that someone else is going to do it.
That's true. That one of the books you held up, You're the One, is all about that shift. And it is true. Many of us make our mate selection choices based on this idea that finally here's this person who can take care of my exile. They can make me feel good about myself. They can make me feel protected and safe. This person is going to do it for me. And so these young parts of us attach to that person as their caretaker or attachment figure. And the problem with that approach is that that person is going to hurt us at some point, even inadvertently, and can't be that caretaker for those exiles in the way that they want. And so when that happens, our protectors come in a big way and say, oh my God, we've got to get them to change back. And they'll either attack or try to cajole, somehow get that person to become the redeemer they were supposed to be. And when that doesn't work, they think, well, maybe if I change, maybe if I lose weight or I stop nagging or something, then it'll change. And if that doesn't work, oh my God, this wasn't really the real redeemer. That person's still out there somewhere. And they'll go look for the real Mr. Right or Mrs. Right. And then when that doesn't work, a lot of people just give up on, like the woman you were role playing had a voice saying, maybe I'm doomed, so maybe I should just go to work or focus on some drug or something to get me through life. So that's the bind most of us are in, not knowing that we can become what I call the primary caretaker to our own parts, to our own exiles, which frees our partner up to be the secondary caretaker of them. And most of us have it reversed. We want our partner to be the primary caretaker, and we don't know how to take care of these parts of us. So that's a lot of what we try to help people do, is learn that they can take care of these exiles who are so needy and raw, which then allows the partner to be freed up. The partner doesn't have to be in this rigid box all the time. And the partner feels the relief of that. So, and from my point of view, too many therapies, for example, are based from attachment theory on this idea that your partner should become that caretaker.
Yeah, I've also been aware of some therapists that I really respect and whose work I admire at many levels, but also is rooted in kind of this other person containing the container of safety. Mm-hmm. And, it is a balance, right, in terms of life, in terms of interdependence, autonomy, mm-hmm. wanting to connect and be able to, merge without enmeshment. I mean, this is mm-hmm. the dance of life. You come together, you come apart. And so whether there's our relative self, there's our spiritual self, that there really are sort of fluctuations and waves to the ways in which we interact with life. And so to that end, to somebody who says, well, that's nice. Okay. I can imagine coming from a more grounded place. I can imagine, yes, I can recall times when I've been clear-headed and felt myself or felt mm-hmm. grounded, like I'm not pulled apart by my parts, Mm-hmm. But can I stay in self 100% of the time? Is it possible? Is it something that I can only dip into from time to time when I do all of this really mindful attention to these parts?
Yeah. I haven't run into a person who can stay in self all the time, including myself. But I can do it a whole lot more than I could before I knew about my parts and related to them this way. And I can do it almost in every context, except when I fight with my wife, when there are certain parts that still come up. And again, in terms of making repairs and reconnecting after something like that, I'm much better at it, because when she's so furious with me, I don't say to myself, oh my God, we're going to split up. I say, okay, here's this angry part of her. She still loves me. It's just a part. It's not all of her, even though it's saying these mean things. And I know she's going to do her work, so it's not going to be there forever. And I'm going to work with the parts of me that get so hurt by it, so that I don't have to react in such a protective way. And that creates a very different kind of exchange.
Well, I love that, because it leaves so much room for the humanity of the way that we live. Mm-hmm. And like you say, the compassion for the parts, in the Buddhist philosophy, they talk about Mara, or the shadow side, or whatever mm-hmm. it is that's also a part of us, that the light mm-hmm. does not exist without the darkness, right? That right. Both parts of the same coin, so to speak, but that it's how we relate to them. So what I hear you saying is we're learning to relate to these parts of ourselves differently, knowing that we're girded by, as I said earlier, this rebar, if you will, of self, mm-hmm. that is really sort of where we can drop into, provided that we have the awareness that we're mm-hmm. caught speaking, not, as you say, for a part, but from mm-hmm. a part.
Yes. Yeah, so that was a very nice description of what I'm trying to bring. So, and that concept, that idea of speaking for your parts rather than from your parts, is central to working with couples or or being in a couple, because it's very different if I were to say to you, Francesca, you know, I hate the way you just said that. That would be coming from one of my parts. So, but if I instead took a second and listened inside and said, you know, when, I don't mean what you just said, but hypothetically,
Sure.
what you just said triggered this pretty raw part of me. And then I felt this surge from this angry part. And I just want you to know that it had that reaction. And I said it in this tone of voice and with this kind of energy. It's a very different message than I hate the way you just said that. So the idea of being able to speak self to self, even in conflict, is a big part of this work. And we're training people who do international conflict resolution, actually, to do this process, or mediators and so on.
I love that. The world needs more of it for sure, because we continue to, I think, have folks who are speaking from parts,
Yes.
making really big decisions a lot
Yes.
of the time. And
Not to mention any names, particularly.
I wouldn't do that.
Right.
But I do think that's true, and yet along those lines, there's something that keeps people from wanting to look at these things and be compassionate toward themselves. And oftentimes, it is a quality of go forth and conquer that gets people to leadership positions.
Yeah.
It's that hyper autonomy, that sort of false sense of bravado. And so in terms of like, not to skip way ahead, but like healing in terms of the world, in terms of sort of the shift that we could make from a more, I don't know, you could call it a patriarchal culture, you could call it a non-connected or a subjugative, kind of a model. I don't know, you could call it anything. But how are we doing, like, when we heal ourselves, how do you think that sort of is the drop in the bucket, if you will, for healing this larger context of?
Yeah. I'm convinced that the big goal is to bring more self to this planet in general. And that if we can do that individually, that's great. But we could also do it culturally if we could unburden some basic extreme beliefs and emotions our culture carries and our planet carries. And were you at Tony Robbins' thing at the Networker?
No, I was in a different seminar.
Oh, yeah. So he's the prime example of what we have to unburden. Because his whole message is, don't worry about the past, don't worry about these weak emotions. You can do it through willpower. And it's a very exiling message. And that's very in sync with our culture. This is a rugged individualist culture that said, just let it go, don't look back, just move on. But that message itself creates a lot of both exiling in terms of people in our country, but also emotions that are vulnerable inside of ourselves. And so if we could, that's one of my goals, is just to counter that approach to life. That's such an American sort of tragedy.
I agree with you, and yeah, I chose not to go to that, even though I know he's very popular, because there was another sort of seminar that I felt was more beneficial to what it is that I'm trying to bring more insight into in the world, that happened to be on childhood sexual abuse and incest, which gets me to my next question about your work, is that this method, along with eating disorders and with really just about anything, but is particularly effective with trauma and childhood sexual abuse, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about why this works well with folks who have experienced those kind of traumatic stories?
Well, partly, in part because of some of what we already talked about, which is that so most survivors of abuse of different kinds have lots of exiles, because that's the way they survived. They had to lock away the parts of them that are still living back in the abuse scenes. And they have protectors who don't want to go anywhere near that, and understandably. And so I had to learn ways to honor these protectors for their service like you would the military, but also come with a kind of sales pitch that if they were willing to let us go to the vulnerable parts that they protect, we could heal those parts, so then the protectors would be freed up. They wouldn't have to do these extreme things anymore. Mm. They could do something they'd much prefer inside of the client. And we could do all of that without them being overwhelmed, without the system being overwhelmed by the exile's feelings, and so on. So, and they're the boss. If they don't want us to do it, we won't do it. They're totally in charge. But because all of these parts that other systems see as symptoms, like dissociation or panic attack or whatever, with trauma survivors, suicidality, all of these things that are thought to be pathological psychological processes are really the activities of protective parts. So we don't get scared of them. And we don't worry about the window of tolerance and all of that stuff. We just go to them and negotiate in this way. So if I was working with you and you suddenly became dissociated, I wouldn't try to ground you. I wouldn't say, look in my eyes and take some deep breaths. Because the message that gives to that part that wants to take you out right now is, you can't do that. You shouldn't be doing that. You're not.
You don't have a right to
exactly, yeah. So instead I would say, Francesca, let me talk to the part that just took you out. And I would let it speak through your mouth, and I would say, okay, so why did you come in right now? And the part would tell us how you were getting too close to some emotion that it thought would be bad, so it took you away. I said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that we had done that. I'm going to be more careful in the future. Would you let her come back? And boom, you'd be grounded again. So it's a different paradigm for understanding all these things and working with them.
Right. Well, it's very compassionate, as you say, in terms of being gentle with the, being very observant in terms of what's happening with your clients, but also being very gentle in the way in which it's an invitation. And it's also I hear you say, and I've heard you said it before, that we're asking our parts permission to be accessing these other, more challenging aspects of ourselves, but that we're bowing, if you will, to the fact that there is a reason why they're acting in the way that they are, and that we're just understanding the reason why, so that we can then say, oh, okay, and then come back in with prefrontal cortex, kind of activity, if you will. Along those lines, can you talk about how this shows up somatically for people? Because a lot of what I've sort of come to understand about well-being is not just shoulders up, that we can understand a lot, but that much of it has to do with heart, head, gut, and this feeling, intuition, and also just this sense of well-being in our own body, that we can, have a right to take up space and be here on the planet, as opposed to shirk away or fight everybody off.
Yeah, well, if we're staying in the realm of survivors, so most people who've had those terrible experiences as kids, their parts don't want them to be in their bodies, and they have ways of keeping them out of their bodies. And so this is one of the concerns I have about some practices that try to embody right away without permission from these protectors. So, example, we just worked with somebody's dissociating whenever they get close to a certain feeling. My approach would be, let's get to know this part and why it's doing that and honor it, and then negotiate permission to let you be in your body. And then when it gives you permission, you feel much more fully embodied. And again, similarly, there are parts that keep you up in your head because they're afraid of these emotions that live in your body. So rather than trying to do practices that make you come into your body, I'm finding those parts, finding out what their fears are, negotiating, and then suddenly you're embodied and you live much more from a heart place. So it's one of my big beefs with certain therapies and spiritual practices that see embodiment as which it is. Embodiment is really important, but actively trying to get people embodied will work for some people, but there's a percentage, particularly survivors, who will have big backlash reactions to that. I was on a panel not too long ago with the Dalai Lama, the Mind and Life Conference, and a woman named Tanya Singer was part of the panel, who's done all this research on meditators and compassion. She's a big researcher on compassion, and she's done a study. They had 3 conditions. One was MBSR, basically, and one was a la Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, self-compassion practice. And then the third was parts-based, based on my work, condition. And they had like 90 measures for each of these, and it's an amazing amount of data that's coming out on it. But on that panel, she said she was interested to find that over 30% of the people who tried the self-compassion couldn't do it. And some of them dropped out and they just couldn't do it. And my belief is, and what I said then is, it's likely that those people are trauma survivors. And so to open your heart through practices is scary to parts, and they're not going to let it happen until they believe it's safe to let you open your heart. And I don't believe that Buddhism has a good way of working with trauma. So, of course, that made headlines in the Buddhist newspaper. So anyway, that's my critique about practices that actively try. And again, they'll work for a lot of people, but it's not respectful to the parts that don't want to let people embody again until they know it's absolutely safe to do so.
Right. Well, I mean, there's an adage even in regular speak, you know, it never hurts to ask, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, in a way, if that was also incorporated into whatever the protocols, even existing protocols that don't include your overall model,
Yeah.
That would be one intervention that one could make overall.
Absolutely. That's right.
That would be a very minor, but perhaps very effective intervention in a
There
lot.
are a lot of EMDR practitioners are now, before they do any of this, saying, let's just see if there are parts that don't want to go in there, and and get permission to do this before they do it. And they find they have far less backlash, they have far better results.
It's fascinating because, again, we're working with, you know, these neurological wirings and a body that's been used to doing things in a certain way for safety. And in order to sort of start to unlock that and decalcify that, you know, like you say, to open the heart, it takes a little bit more. I want to talk about addiction really briefly. How does that show up with this practice, whether it's drugging, drinking, eating, sexing, gambling, you name it? Who would they fall into in terms of exiles, managers, protectors, and how do we talk to those parts of us that are engaging in behavior that we know isn't really helpful, but we can't really help it?
Yeah, so addiction is usually a 3-part phenomena. So there's the critic who says you're a shit, and then there's a part who believes it, who thinks you're bad, that would be an exile. It carries a lot of you know, sense of worthlessness or insignificance or neglect and abuse. And then there's the part that tries to get you away from any of those feelings. When the exile comes up, then this part has to immediately go into action to get you higher than those flames of emotion till they burn themselves out. So addiction is usually what we call a firefighter. It's fighting those exiles' flames of emotion. And that would be the third part in this triangle. And too many systems just say no, not knowing that, first of all, this part cannot not react. It thinks you're going to die if it doesn't get you out of that fire. And that every time you fail, it brings more worthlessness to the exile and more ammunition for the critic. And every time the message comes to you that you should be able to do this, the critic gets on you even stronger, which brings more shame to the exile, which makes the firefighter's job that much harder. And some systems can succeed in getting the critical manager part to sit on the firefighter in addition to the exile, but then you turn into a dry drunk and you're addicted to the meetings and to the system. what we try to do is first go to the critic, because unless you can get it off the client's back, you're not going to get anywhere. And we work with it to see that its approach, while we get it's trying to help, is really backfiring. And then we go to the firefighter, to the addiction part, and let it know we get how much it's trying to help here and how much it absolutely believes it has to do this. But would it give us permission to go to the exile that it's protecting so we can heal that? And what would it like to do if it didn't have to do this addiction thing all the time? And you'll be amazed at the answer to that. And so we go heal the exile, we come back, and now the addict part is wanting to do something entirely different. Mm-hmm. So that's our approach. It's very much in line with, I don't know if you know Gabor Mate's work or.
Yes, I do. Yeah. And I think it's very valuable because in my own sort of experience in studying addiction and looking at it, it's really more like, how does this serve? What is the purpose behind it? It's doing something that, you know, it's looking to do something.
Okay, but even that, just to, if you don't mind my.
No, it's go ahead.
Because when you say to somebody, what is your addiction serving you? How is your addiction? The implicit message is you, Francesca, are getting something out of this. If you give a different message, yeah, there's a part of you that does this. It's got its reason for doing it. The reason is protective. It's trying to keep you away from these other feelings. It's a different message about you. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, it's not all of me that is the addict. That's why I don't like labeling like that. You know, right. He's not an addict. There may be a part that is, like you say, you know, engaging in a certain behavior for reasons that you would discover if you were to ask it why it's doing these things, you know, which really cuts to the core of my thing. I think, you know, and we'll close shortly because it's our time is almost up. But the thing is I think a lot of people say they want to be well, or say they want to be happier, or say they want things to be easier. And I also think that a lot of folks aren't really all that sold on the fact that they think it's possible.
Sure, that's right.
And don't have a felt experience of what it would be like. Mm-hmm. To live with more freedom and ease, mm-hmm. and that it's not a state that we get to that's fixed or static, but more this sort of conversation that's really ongoing that we're mm-hmm. having with ourselves, where, as you said, things may be mitigated, to use that language. I don't know if you would use that, but they may lessen over time in terms of the volume of some mm-hmm. of our parts' voices, mm-hmm. like you said, you and your wife or something, you know. Mm-hmm. But that they may be there, but that's okay because we have cultivated an ability to tap into this deeper self with a capital S that you say.
Well, this is a debate I have with a lot of meditators. So that's sort of the position that a lot of the spiritual community takes and the mindfulness community takes. Tara Brach, you know, just kind of learn to live with and be accepting of. And actually that is a big step, and it helps loosen things up a lot. And if you take the next step and actually go to these parts rather than just observing them and heal them in the way I've described, they will transform and you won't have these voices. They totally change. So I'm a advocate of total transformation, and it's possible, and it's not that hard. I mean, it's hard. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do to go to these places, but the actual process isn't as hard as we have thought.
I love that, and I love the fact that, in fact, you know, to go back to this sort of spiritual language for a minute, I remember when I was through my journey, and I'm of course still journeying, but that my fundamental pivot point was understanding that there's nothing wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And really getting that.
Yeah.
And then knowing that that was something that was there underneath everything, and that the other stuff I could work with or learn about.
And there are parts that aren't on board with that. They do still think there's something wrong with you that you need to go to and help them heal. So And that's true for me too, that I'm still working with. But
Right.
I can honestly say to you, I used to have a brutal inner critic, and that part is now just a cheerleader. I never feel critical of myself. So just in terms of your comparison, all of that is possible.
And would that be sort of, if you will, enlightenment in a certain way? I mean, what more could enlightenment be rather than not being the own monkey on your own back all the time and then having an open heart?
Well, for me, what everybody has called enlightenment is really just this shift in identity from our parts and their burdens to the self. That's what every spiritual tradition has thought of as enlightenment, knowing that this is who we really are. And it's right there. It's just beneath the surface. So.
And that is where we will leave it. We will leave it with the self. I love that. I love the work that you do. I know a lot of other folks that I respect and work with and have talked to also. Dick Schwartz, Ph.D., Internal Family Systems is the book, number 1. You are the one that you've been waiting for. Again, book number 2, dealing a little bit more with relationships. Dick, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we close today?
Just those books and a lot of others material are on our website, which is selfleadership.org. Again, selfleadership.org. And that's all. So great talking to you, Francesca.
Yeah, amazing to talk to you too as well. I hope this has helped some folks. I know that your work has, and you have a network of IFS, internal family systems trained folks all across the country and around the world. That's also available on the website. So thank you so much, Dick, for being with us today on Wise Girl. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.